Hi everyone, welcome to our second video for week 2, unit 2. For this video, we're going to be talking about Plato's Phaedo dialogue and Epicurus' letter to Menoetius. And just as a little warning, the Phaedo is a little long, and it's kind of difficult. But what we're going to try to do together is we're just going to try to extract the most important parts for our own purposes. And if you have questions about some passages that are really puzzling, I would very highly encourage you to post about it on our discussion forum. That would definitely be the best way to get all of us sort of on the same page about the things that we find confusing and the things that we find okay in this dialogue. I hope, despite the fact that it's somewhat long, the fact that it's written in a dialogue format makes it more digestible. And then Epicurus' letter is famously very short and very to the point. So hopefully they pair well together. As I mentioned, for this unit, we're sort of doing little pairings where there will be some direct contrast between the claims of the philosophers that we're reading. For last week, that was Plato's Crito dialogue and Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. For this video, it's going to be the Phaedo and Epicurus' letter to Menoetius. And the reason why these are paired together is because they both really have to do with death, right? Essentially, they ask the same question. What do we make morally or ethically out of the fact that we all are going to die, right? What does it mean sort of for the role of a philosopher? The recognition that death is inevitable, right, to some extent. I mean, no, not to some extent. It really just is inevitable, right? We're going to see a kind of somewhat different view from Epicurus, but we'll see about that in a moment. So, a lot of people, I think, turn to religion, right? They turn to religious sort of answers about their own soul and the idea of an afterlife. And even if you aren't sympathetic to that idea, I mean, I think you should at least kind of see the pull of it, right? The pull of it is the idea that we need to think in some ways that our own sort of like moral thinking can in some way match up with the way that the world is, right? So if you can be like atrociously evil and face no consequences for that whatsoever, then that sort of undermines our faith that morality or like a good life or something like that is even really possible in an unjust world, right? And Socrates is himself dealing with an instance of injustice, of his own indictment by the Athenian people and his execution, which is detailed in this dialogue. And Epicurus, he's writing around the same period as the Stoics, right? And so a lot of that literature too, and he's also an ancient Greek figure, but importantly different from Plato, as we shall see. But all of this is sort of, how do you cope with, what ethical conclusions do you reach from the fact that we are all destined for death in some ways? And what is the relationship between philosophical engagement and death? Okay. So, to begin with, so I've written up here Plato's Phaedo and Epicurus' letter, and I start out on the Plato side of things by noting that this dialogue is noticeably more Platonic than Socratic, right? What do I mean by that? Well, sometimes Plato writes dialogues, and he seems to be like more or less faithfully replicating the actual beliefs of the really existing Socrates. And we have strong evidence that there was an actually existing Socrates, and he's not just like made up by Plato or something like that, because we have other concurrent writers, right? Like Socrates shows up as somebody made fun of in a tragedy, for example. It's roughly contemporaneous with Plato's writings, right? But sometimes Plato uses Socrates more as a mouthpiece for his own ideas, right? And it would make sense why he would do that, right? Because Socrates is supposed to be this exemplar of philosophical wisdom, right? And if you think your own ideas are right, right, then it makes sense to write those ideas as coming out of the mouthpiece of philosophical wisdom, right? And so, but like, how do we know? Well, Socratic dialogues tend to be more open ended, or sometimes people will say aphoretic, which just means like paradoxical, right? So, like the Euthyphro. The Euthyphro dialogue does not end with a satisfying conclusion about what piety is, right? It just sort of ends on this note of frustration and confusion, right? And this tends to really characterize a lot more of the Socratic dialogues. We think of this as probably dialogues that Plato wrote during his early period. Now, other dialogues, if you've been in other classes or something like that, you might have heard of the Republic, which is the most famous Plato dialogue. I highly recommend that everyone here read it. If you ever get the chance, if you can take ancient Greek philosophy or, Greek thought or something like that, it's really, a great thing, I think, for everyone to read. In that text, Socrates is making more expansive claims about knowing things, right? He claims, like, not just like, I don't know what's going to happen after death or something like that, so I have no reason to fear it, but instead says, oh, I do know, right? And it has something to do with this theory of forms, right? Which is a distinctly Platonic idea that we're going to talk about in the Phaedo, because the Phaedo is really the first text that we get where Plato starts using Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own ideas, right? And we're going to see Socrates bring up the theory of forms in this dialogue. And I believe that most experts understand this to be the sort of like first appearance of this idea that Plato in particular is very, very famous for. So this dialogue is more Platonic in the sense that Socrates makes much more robust claims to knowledge. Socrates in this dialogue claims to know things about the soul, right? That's actually why he's not worried, right? He shifted from in the Apology not really being worried about death because he doesn't know what's going to happen to him in the afterlife, to here in the Phaedo now thinking like, oh no, well, I'm actually excited about dying because I know, what the afterlife is like and why it's good for philosophy and why, because I'm a philosopher, I have to be sort of practicing dying all of the time, right? So it's much more kind of robust in that way, and you can see a difference between the Apology and the Phaedo, or even the Crito, right? There, Socrates sort of still has this idea of like, well, convince me otherwise, right? But in these last moments before his execution, Socrates drinks hemlock, which is like poison, and if you like read about what it's like to drink hemlock, it is not pleasant at all. And there's sort of Plato writes it like, oh, Socrates, he's taking it so well, and he's so noble, and he's not worried at all, blah, 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 right? That's another aspect of this dialogue. And so Socrates is sort of like giving his last word on what he thinks it means to be a philosopher, and what he thinks it means to live a good life, and like whether or not the fact that you might die because you decided to live that life, whether that should really change any of your decision making about that, right? Okay, so let's start digging into a couple of quotes here. Ooh, excuse me. So this quote is the pink one right here. Socrates says, I think a man who has spent his life in philosophy is probably right to be in good cheer in the face of death. ... The one aim of those who practice philosophy in the proper manner is to practice for dying and death, right? This is very metal, right? It's very metal, very, very interesting, very cool idea, right? The idea that philosophy is preparation for death, right? And that there is sort of a specific intimate connection between philosophical thinking and death, right? So what is the nature of that connection? Well, Socrates arrives at the conclusion that death is separation of the soul from the body, right? So like that's what happens whenever you die, is that your body becomes damaged or atrophied to such an extent that it can no longer contain your soul escapes, right? And in Plato's specific theory, becomes embodied again in someone else, right? Somewhere else, right? And you had like a previous life, right? And so we have this idea of the soul as something that is sort of eternal and indestructible, right? Embodies as things that perish, right? And go away, and are in some ways the product of illusion. Because Socrates claims that truth takes place in the soul, right? And what does he mean by that? Well, what he means is that, like, whenever we sense things, right? Say I, hold in front of my face like a pen or something like that, right? My body only allows me to notice certain kinds of features about it, right? Like I can see it from a certain perspective. I see certain colors, right? But if I had the eyesight of like an eagle or something like that, right, then my knowledge about the pen, my ability to sense it, would be dramatically increased, right? And so Plato has this idea that truth happens sort of like in the mind or in the soul, right? That, like, in the case where you see an optical illusion, right? Say if you have a cup of water and you put a pen in and it appears like it's bent, right? The way that Plato would describe that phenomena is he would say, well, your body is presenting you an illusion, right? Right? You're seeing something, but you're seeing it not in the way that it really is. And this is what happens with all sorts of optical illusions, right? And the mind is what decides, oh, well, the pen didn't really, bend in water. Instead, what happens is that the water bends the medium of light, and that's what makes the, pen appear bent or something like that, right? Socrates' point is that the decision-making process, the way to arrive at the truth, the way to dispel illusion, right? All of that resides in the mind or in the soul, right? And so we have this idea that the body is inessential and changeable, right? Whereas the soul is permanent and indestructible and rational, right? And essential, right? That's the part of you that you really are, according to Plato, right? Is not, the particular vicissitudes of your body or something like that, but the aspect of yourself that you genuinely choose to be, right? The part where you make decisions, where you evaluate things, that's what you take responsibility for and what you really are. And that's why Plato says that truth takes place in the soul, right? And Plato has this vision where really I think what's going on is that he's thinking about what prevents philosophical activity, right? And he locates that in earthly desires, right? So, like, what prevents you from seeking out the truth? Well, because you become satisfied with a certain kind of illusion, right? Someone will give you money, or they will be very happy with you. They will allow you to satisfy in various ways your earthly, needs and desires. And in that way, we sort of fall into a kind of bad faith, right? And so Plato sees it as essential to the sort of role of philosophy insofar as you're seeking after truth, right? You're seeking after those eternal aspects of existence, not the changeable material stuff, but the really real ideal stuff, right? What does Plato mean by that? Well, let's consider this quote right here. Plato claims at one point through the mouth of Socrates that all beautiful things are beautiful by the beautiful, right? Capitalized. So what does that mean? Well, he explains like, okay, if you were to call some painting or sculpture or something like that beautiful, it must be beautiful not in virtue of having certain colors or something like that, right? Because other objects also have those colors and aren't beautiful, right? Instead, it must be because it somehow represents or participates in the idea of beauty, right? And this is where you get Plato's very celebrated theory of forms, right? And essentially what the forms do is the forms are some eternal, aspect of the world that we don't see or hear or experience that makes the world intelligible, right? Well, what makes, a number of things courageous? What makes, like, you might say, standing up for your civil liberties or something like that, or going out and taking a big risk, etc. Like, what makes all of those things courageous? Well, the Platonic theory really goes, well, that they share some similarity by virtue of participating in the idea of courage. So the forms, also called ideas, are sort of like the goal or the limit that all of this stuff aspires to, right? Beautiful stuff is beautiful because it participates or references or represents in some way the beautiful, right? And the philosopher is concerned with those things, right? Socrates wasn't satisfied with Euthyphro just giving examples of pious things, right? He wanted an explanation of the form of the pious, right? And this is really how Plato interprets Socrates' questioning, is that Socrates is dissatisfied with anything but the form of that which he is investigating, right? And that's exactly what these sort of like non-philosophers are not able to give to him, right? And so in this dialogue, Plato establishes um, a sort of consonance or something like that, a sort of harmony between the idea of death as the separation of the soul from the body and philosophy as the search after truth. For the genuinely true things for Plato are the forms, and the forms are eternal. And just like the soul is eternal and the forms are eternal, right? So you should celebrate the fact that you are no longer going to be marred in illusion, right? You're no longer tied to the vicissitudes of this world that are constantly changing and different and so on, right? And Socrates expresses this idea so forcefully that right before drinking the hemlock, he says to Crito, Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius, right? And I think the footnote there explains this. Asclepius is sort of like a healer, right? And so owing a cock to Asclepius means that they owe this figure chickens for healing him for getting rid of his mortal body, right? He's thanking this figure for, basically allowing him to get over the sickness and the ills of life, right? And return to the domain of the eternal with philosophical inquiry, right? So yeah, Socrates drinks the hemlock and accepts his death, and argues that that is the only right thing for a philosopher to do. The philosopher should not be fazed by any of this other stuff, that you should only search after truth, and that you should be willing to accept any and all consequences for it, right? And so I think that that is part of why philosophers have so much love and reverence for Socrates, is that he martyred himself for the sake of philosophy, right? And then we get this beautiful, effusive dialogue from Plato that sort of explains how that's the appropriate standpoint for a philosophical point of view. So now we're going to look briefly at Epicurus to get a contrasting point of view, right? And this text is really short, and so Epicurus really gets into the meat of things really quickly. So let's go through this first quote together. He's sort of like giving advice to his friend Menoetius, and in that way wrote like one of the best self-help letters ever to be written, like ever for sure, right? And now we get to read it together, like, some 1,000 years later. Okay, cool. First quote. Get used to believing that death is nothing to us, for all good and all bad consist in sense experience. Hence, a correct knowledge of the fact that death is nothing to us makes the mortality of life a matter of contentment, not by adding a limitless time to life, but by removing the longing for immortality. So here you get a very different perspective than what you get in Plato, right? I think that most people that would read Epicurus's letter would say about Plato that there's certainly some longing for immortality, right, still present in Plato's account, right? And Epicurus's account is much different, right? It's much closer to a materialist account. And a materialist account is one where what makes up the world are not like the eternal forms and souls and stuff like that, but matter, right? Matter and its changes are what truly exist, right? And so here we get a perspective on death that doesn't draw so heavily on a very controversial notion of the soul. And it's important to emphasize that what he says is not that you should celebrate death or that you should practice death, right? Because for Epicurus, this idea is nonsensical. Death is nothing to us, right? And he goes on to explain that because good and bad consist in sense experience, right? Things are painful to me or they're pleasant to me, right? And that forms the basis for my judgments about what is good and what is bad, right? So something like death, which is by definition sort of outside of the purview of my experience, is sort of beyond good and bad, right? There's no reason for me to fear it at all because it's not something that I could ever experience. So this not only allows us to sort of like get over the fear, the maybe instinctual or something like that, fear that we have of death, it allows us to think about our life as a matter of contentment, right? Not because we're going to live forever, right? But because we are able to remove the desire to live forever, remove the fear that we have over dying, right? This fear that motivates us, in I think both Epicurus and Plato's view, to commit certain kinds of wrongdoing, right? And to hurt our own self, right? In a much deeper way than others can really ever hurt us, right? Death, the most frightening of bad things, Epicurus says, is nothing to us, since when we exist, death is not yet present, and when death is present, we do not exist, right? So death, as a cessation of experience, is then, by its very concept, beyond experience, right? And so it's never something that we could actually encounter, right? And so there's nothing that we actually even have to fear, right? And so rather than living our life in a way that is characterized by our fear of death, right? Epicurus directs us instead to those aspects of life that make it worth living, right? He says pleasure is the starting point and goal of living blessedly, right? And this led people for a very long time to say that Epicurus was a hedonistic philosopher. And so hedon is an ancient Greek word which means like pleasure, right? And so to say someone is a hedonist is normally to say that they like engage in gratuitous drinking and, eating and gluttony and so on, right? That they enjoy too much sort of the pleasures of this earth, right? And you can see how you would get that sort of interpretation from Epicurus saying that pleasure is the starting point and goal of living blessedly. But importantly, for Epicurus, right, his vision of pleasure is not like going out and getting like extremely wasted or something like that, getting very drunk, but is instead doing philosophy, right? That he says things like, well, it's when you can be content with very little that you can actually enjoy the small amount that you get, and the less sort of dependent you are on material possessions for your own satisfaction and happiness, right? And so pleasure really comes from the cultivation of virtue, right? And true understanding, right? What lets you sort of get over the fear of death in Epicurus is not becoming like, extremely courageous or something like that, right? Instead, it comes through philosophical activity. It's because you realized philosophically that you have nothing to fear with death, that your fear of death is sort of a certain illusion, right? That you can then reorient your life towards the things that give you pleasure, right? And so despite the fact that Epicurus was called a hedonist, and he does in fact think that pleasure is the sort of central aspect of what makes our life worth living, he also believes that you live the most pleasurable life whenever you're very modest, right? And whenever you practice moral precepts and live as a virtuous person, right? And then I wrote here that a kind of brief summary of the last paragraph, but I'll just read it out to you because I think it's so cool and so epic, right? Okay. He says, and I quote, "Practice these and the related precepts day and night by yourself and with a like-minded friend, and you will never be disturbed, either when awake or in sleep, and you will live as a god among men. For a man who lives among immortal goods is in no respect like a mere mortal animal," right? So whenever you discover the immortal goods of virtue and contentment, then the mortal goods of riches, say, or sex, or alcohol, or whatever other sort of like carnal pleasures, right? Those amount to nothing, right? Okay, I hope that you've enjoyed this video about what you should think about death. I am very interested to hear your own opinions about what we should do about the fact that we all die, and how should we think about whether it affects our life and in what way. Really looking forward to hearing your thoughts. I hope you have a great week. Bye-bye.